start putting some things together here. And this section might seem a little bizarre at first, but it can be very, very fun. So we're going to be looking at listing possibilities here and doing something called random assembly selections. So we're going to be looking at major features of the landscape. So I'm just going to choose two different headings here just for simplicity's sake to kind of give you an idea of how this thinking process is going to work. So if we look at, I should make this blue actually so that it kind of corresponds a bit better. So if we look at the water on our property, perhaps we have tanks for rainwater, for irrigation purposes. We might have some ponds on our property for holding water. We maybe have some swales. We might have a canal that's joining two ponds together. We might have a spring. We might have a creek or a stream, maybe a river, maybe a lake. So there's quite a few different water features that we might actually have on our property. Now, when we try and pair those up with, let's say, structures that are on our land. So structures could be earth banks. So as we saw in previous examples that the earth banks were oftentimes kind of sheltering a house either from the sun or from the wind. We might have a house on our property. We might have a trellis. So there's a bunch of different types of trellises too. We could have a hoop trellis or a teepee trellis or a lattice trellis or a ridge trellis or a vertical trellis. So lots of different types of trellises that we could have. We might have a fence. Other structures might be animal housing. Maybe a greenhouse. And perhaps a shade house of some sort as well, depending on what kind of climate you're in. So when we're looking at a property and we see a lot of these types of things that we have at our disposal, but we're not too sure how to connect things together, a really kind of useful tool is to write down all of the elements that you have. And you can do this just mentally as well. You don't necessarily have to be writing these things down and drawing arrows between them. It's just a certain way of looking at a property that helps you think outside the box and helps you come up with scenarios and solutions that people normally wouldn't have. So some of the connecting words that we might want to use could be attached to, over, beside, in, on, under, containing. And then what we simply do is we look at some of the possibilities. So we could look at what happens if you put a trellis over a tank. So if we put a trellis over a tank, I can think of a couple different things that this might do. So if we did this, this would shade the tank from the sun. So especially if you had a tank that was really prone to algae accumulating and things like that, it would be beneficial to put the trellis over top of the tank in order to shade it from the sun so that that algae doesn't form. Also, if that water is getting too hot and evaporating, like maybe there isn't a lid on the tank or something like that, then maybe you would want to shade it as well from the sun. So what would be the advantages of connecting some of these elements? So we just went through the advantages, but what would be the disadvantages of putting a trellis over a tank? So I guess putting a trellis over a tank would also make the tank harder to access. Maybe it would create an environment where wasps would build a nest and it's right next to your area where you're eating outside and you don't want the wasps there. There are things that could happen both advantageously and disadvantageously if we connect some of these elements. So we can look at all sorts of different kinds of combinations when we have all of these possibilities listed. So another one that we could look at would be what happens when you put a greenhouse over a tank. So instead of a trellis over a tank, what happens if you put a greenhouse over a tank? Well, then we're going to keep that water a bit warmer than we normally would. Perhaps you get a little bit of a season extension on that tank. Maybe your cistern won't freeze solid if you're in a pretty mild climate. Maybe you can use that tank as a thermal mass in your greenhouse so that it absorbs the heat of the sun during the day and dissipates that heat at nighttime. What if we put the greenhouse attached to a house with a tank inside? Then what would happen? Well, probably the greenhouse and the tank would act as a thermal mass to help heat the house as well. So you can even go back and forth between a lot of these things. So you can go greenhouse over a tank attached to a house, and so on and so forth. You can kind of start bouncing back and forth and really trying to see how a lot of these things would connect. So we could also put a trellis over the tank that's underneath the greenhouse attached to the house, and plant something deciduous over top so that when it drops its leaves in the wintertime, the sun is still coming through and helping to heat everything. But in the summertime, it's shading everything to keep it cool as well. What happens if you put a greenhouse or glass house on the end? So put it over a canal. So let's say that you put the greenhouse over one end of a canal. Well, that end of the canal would be a lot warmer than the other end. So then what if we went and put a shade house over the other end of the canal? Then you're making one end cold and one end warm. And you might think, well, why would I want to do that? Well, if one end is warm and one end is cold, it's going to make the water mix and move and churn a little bit. And with that movement of water, perhaps it's going to be less stagnant and you'll get less mosquitoes. Have no idea if that's going to work or not. Just came to me now. Have no idea, right? But it's another way of thinking about these things and just coming up with very unique combinations of assembling these elements into, will this work? Has anybody done this before? And very often when you're thinking about things in this fashion, you're going to come up with solutions that no one else has come up with before. It'll really help you a lot when you're stuck for ideas. So if you show up on a site and you can't figure out how to connect some of the elements, and you can't figure out how to solve some of the problems, then you can look and make a bunch of these lists and start doing this random assembly in order to try and solve some of the problems. So I'm going to try just one more here. I don't know. Let's try putting a swale, not under a fence, beside a fence. So when I look at that, why would I put a swale beside a fence? The only thing I could think of there would be maybe the animals would come and graze next to the edge of the fence. They might deposit their manure. It would go into the swale. When the swale fills up with water, the nutrients would get spread out, and it would help to spread nutrients down the property. Why would I not want to put a swale beside a fence? Maybe part of the swale path is used for access. So maybe that's where I want to drive and walk all the time. And if there's going to be a fence there, it's going to get in the way. So that's just kind of more or less how this idea works, is just trying to connect a lot of these elements in very unique ideas. And just because something hasn't been done before, it doesn't mean that it's a bad idea. It just means it hasn't been done before. So it gets you looking at all the different possibilities that exist in a way that we don't normally think about things. So we can look at a couple other examples here too. Like, what if you put a ridge trellis, so something that looks like a old school cartoon tent almost, over top of a canal. And then you can start growing things up over the canal. Well, if you start looking at those kind of connections, then you end up getting something that is very similar to a Chinampa system. And a Chinampa system is the most productive system on Earth for growing food. It combines growing food on agricultural land next to water, so that you're combining aquaculture with regular gardening. So you're getting all of the benefits of the water, bacteria, diversity, life, and all of those nutrients, as well as all of those nutrients from the soil as well. And so back when these systems were all developed, these Chinampa systems, it was really an efficient way of harvesting a lot of the food too, because these trellises would come up over the canal, and rather than trying to take a lot of this food and carry it or put it on a mule or actually physically just carry it in sacks or barrels or wheelbarrow it where it needed to go, people could come by underneath and like in the canal itself in a boat and harvest all the food and put it in the boat, and then just simply row the food wherever it needed to go. So it saved them a lot of physical effort as well, because you can move a lot more in a boat, letting the water do all the lifting for you, than you can on land. So another thing that you could try would be maybe trellising, putting a trellis over a swale. I don't think it's really been done that much, but maybe it would eliminate a little bit of evaporation. So when there's a lot of water happening, maybe it would create a situation where there's shade and it would give the moisture more time to soak into the earth. So it might be a good idea in a very dry, hot area like a desert, because we know that desert gardens need to be shaded. And when we're looking at desert gardens, they're a lot different than other gardens that we grow, because as you know, in our northern climate, we need a lot of sun to have enough heat and enough light throughout the day to grow our plants. But when you're in the desert, typically you actually want to block a lot of that sun, because otherwise your plants are just going to suffer from heat stress and it's not going to be very good for them. So when you're looking at a desert garden, just for simplicity's sake, from our map brains, we're going to just set this up like you would regular coordinates, with north being at the top. So if you're looking at the desert garden that is suffering from a lot of heat exhaustion, then 20% of this sun side, so let's say that we're in the northern hemisphere in a desert and the sun is going to be to the south, then 20% of the sun side needs to be shaded and 30% of the east side needs to be shaded. So the morning sun not being quite as warm as the afternoon sun. The afternoon sun, you actually need 75% of the west to be shaded in order to have a really good balance as far as the amount of sun to help grow things, but not too much sun. So this random assembly idea is basically created because sometimes until you make a list, it's hard to come up with some of these ideas. When you're looking at a blank piece of paper or you're just looking out at the landscape, it's very difficult, and we don't realize how empty our systems are until we try to brainstorm some of these random assemblies. When we start making a lot of these connections, these random assemblies, we realize just how many really unique and how really unique ideas and how much potential there is to do things in a different way. So we can look at a couple other examples here too that don't necessarily only involve water. So let's say you had an earth bank next to a house. So this thing here is our earth bank, and we put it next to our house. So if we do this, we can use that earth bank, if we're in a desert, to shelter our house from the hot desert wind. And then we can go a step further and we can say, well, what if we had a trellis connected to the house for extra shade? I don't know how I'm going to make this into a trellis, but we'll do it like that. So maybe we had that just for a little bit of extra shade so that we can walk in between the house and the earth bank and have a really shaded area. Then what if you can grow a garden underneath the trellis? Then you can start producing some food underneath there as well. And what if we use the water from the house to water the garden? So the garden might be underneath here, and it's just partially shaded by the trellis because maybe there's nothing growing on the trellis. But it's more like a pergola kind of idea where there's slats above you, but the light can still kind of come in a more dappled way. Then you can have maybe a garden in there in the desert too, and then all of your gray water from your house can come out directly onto your garden. Or conversely, if you're in a cold climate, and we look at having an earth bank as well, then what if we connect the earth bank to a house? And what if we have this as the north side and this as the south side? North, south, east, west, east there. Okay. So what if you have this earth bank and it's sheltering you from the northwest wind? So this earth bank is about the same height as your house. And so the wind coming from that angle is not hitting your house. This is a lot of times kind of, in this situation I have just the house with an earth bank behind it, but if you're looking at things like earth ships, which are basically houses that are sunk into the side of a hillside, they're very often facing south, and so the hill is to the north side of them. And this way, when the sun shines in, so the sun rises in the east, moves around throughout the day, and it's shining in towards the house, it's also creating kind of a warm pocket here, a little bit of a microclimate for the house to keep it extra warm in the cold weather. And then if we went another step further, what if we put a pond in front of the house? then when the sun is shining in, it might even reflect off the pond towards the house to get even more light for the house as well. So this can help create a microclimate here for the house, and we can also use this earth bank to perhaps grow some trees on just for a little bit of extra wind protection as well. And a little bit of extra privacy as well. And this is just a couple ways of thinking about how to connect a lot of these elements for our benefit.